Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony. This Saturday bonus episode is a recording of an interview we gave on another podcast. Regular Words and Numbers episodes come out each Wednesday.
It's a simple thing that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about human flourishing, and I want you to just think about it for a minute or two, because we tend not to, right? We take our lives for granted and we just move through. But I want you to ask yourself why it is that you do what you do. Because most of the time we're on an autopilot. We don't really think about it all that much. But I want to make a point of thinking about this guy, Aristotle. He had a perspective on this, which I think is very, very instructive to us, even though it was 2,000 years ago or so that he wrote this. And according to Aristotle, the end of human life is the good life, or living well and flourishing would be a pretty good midpoint definition of what Aristotle was talking about. So what is it? What does it entail? What on earth is human flourishing? I've already said that we're all flourishing to some degree, and I'm going to stick with that, but let's unpack it for a minute or two. And for Aristotle, there were three different categories that we had to be concerned with here. First, bodily goods. And these are really, really simple things. So simple, in fact, that when I give this exact lecture to high school students, I say, look, you guys could actually probably take care of these on your own. What are they? Health, vitality, vigor, and pleasure. All simple things that most people could accomplish without any great effort, without a whole lot of money, right? These are accessible to all. So the second thing, external goods. And all right, maybe a little more complicated here. It's not as costless as the first list, but food, drink, shelter, and clothing, basic essentials. And again, most people can handle this. They can get these things on their own. It's this category, goods of the soul, where we start to find all kinds of problems. And what are goods of the soul? Knowledge, skill, love, friendship, aesthetic enjoyment, self-esteem, and honor, according to Aristotle. And you can see how this is going to be a lot trickier than the other two lists. So in the end, what is happiness, right? We're talking about flourishing. Aristotle uses the word happiness. Let's consult Google Dictionary, and you see they commit the cardinal sin here of defining a word with a variation of that word. So happiness is the state of being happy. Sherlock Holmes, that's helpful. We're going to have to do better than that, a lot better than that, actually. And I want to take you through a brief tour of my personal history, because I think that storytelling is more the way we understand these things than strict definitions like we would get here, or reading the many lists that Aristotle makes. He's an inveterate list maker and very, very boring to read as a result. But let's go back to my origin story. I was born in this place, Waterbury, Connecticut, which was the brass capital of the world through World War II and a little bit beyond. And when the cessation of hostilities came along, all the brass mills slowly but surely went out of business. And Waterbury, Connecticut, from that day to this, has specialized in misery and unemployment. And when I was young, when I was a boy, I remember looking around and thinking, I don't belong here. I'm supposed to be somewhere else. I didn't know where, I didn't know why. I was first generation college in my family, so that wasn't held out as an option. And I decided that I really loved this place, Boston, Massachusetts, the greatest city in the United States for my money. And I couldn't wait to get there. So when it came time to apply for college, I thought, hey, maybe I should apply for college. I think I'm smart enough, and maybe I could get myself all the way to Boston. And lo and behold, I did. It wasn't that hard, come to find out. I ended up at Boston University, which is a bit of a diploma factory. Everybody who gets there, mostly, gets a diploma, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I fell in love with certain things once I got there that I really had no business falling in love with, that caused me lots and lots of difficulties. And this is one of them, of course, beer. A lifelong relationship with beer started by the time I got to college. And well, what do you know? My bad behavior, and it was bad, and my grades, which were equally awful, yielded a visit to the dean, who told me to remove myself from Boston University. I got thrown out of college for being such a fabulous screw up. How bad a screw up? I got kicked out of the institution that gave AOC her economics degree. Draw your own conclusions. So I ended up in a bit of an odyssey, and I ended up working in mental institutions and group homes, third shift. So it was a miserable thing. I applied to the University of Connecticut, my state school, and ended up going there. So I would work all night. I would check out of work at about 8 a.m. I would change clothes and shower at work and drive up to stores, which would take about an hour, hour and a half. So it was a long round trip, a lot of working, no free time whatsoever. I mean, none. And this had the effect of teaching me what I already knew, that I had to pay a very big price for the mistakes I made, or maybe not even mistakes, willful acts that I made. And I was okay with that. I always figured I brought it on myself. And what I learned, and this becomes very important in my adult life, is that delayed gratification is the key to success. And anything else I know to be true, I probably know this to be true much more. So after I finished up my bachelor's degree, I actually got two of them, one in history, one in political science, because I had 178 credits laying around because of all the failure before I got to Connecticut. I just kind of gobbled up college when I got back. And I decided I loved it so much that I was going to go to graduate school. So I went here to the Claremont Graduate School, picked up a PhD, and eventually found my way here to St. Vincent College in Western Pennsylvania, a small liberal arts place run by Benedictine monks. And it was a dream job. I couldn't believe I got it. And about 3 years into it, I realized that this was really not that great. It was not a dream job at all. It was the same drudgery that everybody else has at their jobs. And I decided that the job I have is not going to be a big enough deal to make me miserable day after day. So a friend of mine sent me an email, and it said simply, "This is probably too weird for you, but have a look." And it was looking for a professor to go to Iraq and teach there. And I went to DC, and I met this guy, John Agresto, former head of the National Endowment for the Humanities and St. John's College in Santa Fe. And we became fast friends over a 3-hour interview. And he said, "Well, you want to come to Iraq?" And I said, "Yep." And before you know it, I was there. I got promoted twice before I got there. At the end of the interview, he said, "Okay, I want to make you assistant dean, because the woman we have as dean right now she's a small Italian woman from the Bronx, and she yells at people all the time. And this is probably not the best approach in the Middle East. So when things are external to the college, I'm going to send you. And when things are internal to the college, she can handle it." And I agreed. And he went up and told her that he had just hired an assistant for her, an assistant dean. And at that moment, she quit her job and said, "Let him have it." And I said, "Okay, I'll take it." And I found out later the reason why she was so willing to let it go was she had come to work maybe 2 months before I had interviewed. She had come to work, and there was a note on her door. And the note said, "This bullet's not for you." And there was an arrow from a bullet that was taped to the note to a lock of her daughter's hair. Her daughter was 8 years old at the time and had a distinctive hair color, and everybody knew who it was. So that was the reason why I ended up getting promoted. And I moved immediately to this place, the red area here in Iraq, which is Kurdish Iraq. There are Kurdish sections of Syria, Turkey, and Iran as well. And there are 35 million Kurds living in this place. And they're the largest ethnic group in the world without a state. So it causes all kinds of friction and all kinds of international difficulties. Where I lived is more obvious on this map. If you look all the way to the east, you'll see a city called Sulaymaniyah, and that's where I lived. It was about 180 miles dead north of Baghdad, to put it in perspective. I could have been in Iran in about 13 miles, which caused lots of grief and aggravation as well. But this is what the town looked like. And I'm going to make the case here that this is a mostly normal place, if you can believe it. You probably can't. I was a little shocked by it myself. So it's a thriving, functioning city. There's about 1 million people who live there. My place of residence was in one of these luxury buildings, and they were very luxurious. My apartment was huge, deep, dark wood everywhere. It probably would have been $10-12 million in New York or any major American city. Here, I don't even know what they cost. It was all irrelevant to me, and my expenses were picked up by the school. And this was the school, the American University of Iraq, in its temporary housing. And you'll see that the color green is meaningful here, and I'll get to why in a bit. But in short, every political party had a color to represent it. And the party with the color green gave us this building, which caused all kinds of grief because the locals were pretty convinced we were political when we weren't. So what is human flourishing? And I want to think about that in the context I had, because in America, I had taken some things for granted. We all have. And I don't think that's a problem. I think we should take them for granted. It's easy enough to do. But it was more difficult in this kind of place. So I want to introduce you to regular life in this place. And this is the bazaar where you go to do your shopping. You'll see it's kind of like something Indiana Jones would have found himself in. So wide open, kind of sprawling labyrinth of sellers. But as you walk through the first gate, the one that was just up on the screen, and you look immediately to your right, here, I'm going to ask you to think like detectives for a minute or two. The first thing you see is this florist's shop. And I will submit that in order to support a florist, you have to have a relatively well-functioning society and government happening. Florist provides luxury goods, goods that nobody needs to keep living. So there is at least enough to support that. And come to find there's at least enough to support turkeys. This is another 10 feet down the road after the florist. If you look to your right, you'll see this staircase that I used to go down to move down to the end of the road that's there where all these guys are talking. Okay, so turns out turkeys cost $300, which is the average take-home pay for a middle-class person. So turkeys are absolutely a luxury item. Produce, on the other hand, plentiful and delicious. They would pick it the day it was ripe, not 3 weeks ahead like we do here. So believe it or not, the produce was a world better there than it is here. Of course, if you brought it home and didn't use it within 2 days, it would rot right out of your shelves. But again, take a look at the picture a little more deeply, because you should see these two women off to the right. How many times have you heard that women can't go out alone in the Middle East? I heard it all the time, and I never knew it to be true, not in this place. You can see that they are out by themselves. They're dressed very modestly, and they're covering their hair. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute, but there's no doubt that they were out unescorted. So every time I would go to the bazaar, food in Iraq was terrible, apart from the produce. They pickled everything to get around the spoilage problem. Everything you see here is pickled. This is where you would buy your meat. You just kind of walk up and point to the one you want, and they hack at it with a cleaver. And the meat was uniformly disgusting. It was terrible. But why wouldn't it be terrible when it was brought up on grass in a desert area, right? These were not animals that were well cared for, and it showed. So I tended not to eat any of this. I ended up buying my chicken, believe it or not, frozen like a rock from South America, all the way to Iraq and then to me. Cigarettes were everywhere, plentiful and cheap. I was smoking at the time, so that was great news. They were $14 a carton, 68 at home at the same time in Pennsylvania. And here's where it starts getting fascinating. In a place where the average salary is $300 a month, what on earth is going on with all this gold? And this is just a very tight shot of an alley in the bazaar that probably went 2 city blocks that was all loaded with gold. So why are they using it? And I came to learn that there are 2 very distinct reasons why gold is always for sale. The first is a hedge against inflation, which is probably what every one of you was just thinking. I would expect nothing less. The currency in Iraq was worthless. It was 8 dinar to the dollar when Saddam Hussein was running the country. By the time I got there, 1,000 dinar was 18 cents. So the currency just bled, it hemorrhaged value. So when people got their pay, they would take that money, go straight to here, walk straight into one of these offices, one of these stores and trade all the money they had for as much gold as they could get, because the gold was a hedge against inflation and it worked exactly as such. The second reason is a little weirder. All of us are kind of dimly aware that there was a dowry system in the Western world where a girl or a woman's parents would pay off a man or the man's family to marry. Just going to let a bunch of people in to marry their daughters off. And come to find out, there was absolutely a dowry system in Iraq as well, or at least in the Kurdish portion where I lived. However, it works exactly the opposite of what you would think. And there are clear reasons for this. So here, the man's family pays the woman's family in gold for the opportunity to marry their daughter. And it's all because of one Middle Eastern custom that they couldn't get around. It's woven right into the nature of things. Divorce is freely available here, something most people don't realize. The problem is that while divorce is available, and I think important, given individual rights that should be reflected in a country's institutions, if a woman gets married and then gets divorced, she will never be able to marry again, not here. So what happened? The groom's family gave the bride's family a lot of gold. It would be enough to live on for quite some time. The bride's family would just store it somewhere, hide it away. And if the marriage failed, the bride would get the gold and she could live on that for the rest of her life quite comfortably. If the marriage succeeded, her parents would eventually die and the gold would go to the girl and her husband anyway. So everybody was allowed to come out a winner here if the marriage remained intact. But if the marriage failed, the woman was being protected in this way. And you start to realize, okay, these are institutions unlike any I have known, but they're institutions that make perfect sense and they're interesting. Now, as you move through the bazaar, you see all kinds of other things, baubles and trinkets and, rings, ugly, awful rings like this. There was even a rotisserie chicken place. I would go there. It was the one place you could get decent food in the form of restaurant, such that it was. And again, think like a detective. What do you see as you leave the bazaar? This is always how I would leave. And yeah, the vegetable merchants are back, but behind them, you can see that there are plenty of clothing options. You can even see those blue Adidas things that we think of with the Balkan republics, but plenty of fabric as well. People made their own clothing and this sort of thing. And there was a certain kind of thrivingness, if you could even make that word up here. And it gets a little more interesting because when I couldn't do my shopping there were supermarkets in town. So I would go to this one, Kurdistan 2. And again, think like a detective. What do you see in here? I have no idea what that little white girl is doing on the far right-hand portion of this sign. I have no idea what's up with that. But look at the 4 young women on the left. Each one of them is wearing something that would never have been allowed in this town. To give you a point of reference, I was told never to wear shorts. I got there, and the day I got there was 118 degrees, and I had to go out shopping in my jeans because men could not show their legs at all without repercussions. Women couldn't show their legs or anything below their neck without repercussions. So shoulders fresh out. The woman third from the left, bare legs under a skirt, absolutely not. That would never happen there. When students at the university would wear skirts or dresses, they would wear jeans underneath them. It was bizarre, but that was the local culture. The first woman on the left and the second, it looks like, and the fourth, bare shoulders all, never would have been accepted. And you see just how people react when these sorts of things happened in town. It was always kind of ugly. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth is it on this sign? And now I start to think, well, this is aspirational in a way. And when the people I met there would talk to me seriously, I came to realize that they wanted Western sensibilities to be introduced into their culture. They just were unsure on how to do it. And that became very instructive. There's a certain universality to certain things. Now I can show you what our students looked like to help put it in perspective. These 4 young women are in the library doing a group project, and you see that, they're all very modestly dressed, but 2 have their hair covered and 2 don't. And nobody that I ever met there thought that was a big deal in any way. They thought that was a personal choice, and however you choose is however you choose. This woman was much, much more conservative. All that showed was her face and hands, and nobody there criticized that either. It was good enough. The guys all kind of looked Western with their clothing. You could see another girl in the back with the big giant hair, not hiding it. And then things got really weird. Remember, I'm the dean, so I'm in charge of all academic and non-academic discipline. And a girl came. She was very young. I think she was 19. And I had never met her because I typically only dealt with problem children, and this girl was not a problem. And she said, Dr. James, they called me James. She said, Dr. James, I have come to say goodbye. And I said, all right, where are you going? And she said, my parents have arranged a marriage for me. I later found out that roughly 40% of the marriages there are in fact arranged, to my 48-year-old cousin. And I said, oh, how about that? That's not great. And she said, I must go home and kill myself this afternoon. And that kind of gets you sitting up straight. And I'm dealing with teachers here. I'm sure you guys know this. But if you ask somebody who talks about suicide how they're going to do it, and you get a fast answer, you got a problem. That person's probably going to do it and do it soon. If you get something like hemming and hawing, well, maybe this, maybe that, you might have a little more time. So I asked this woman, I said, all right, how are you going to do that? She said, oh, I'm going to go into my parents' house, go into the bathroom, cover myself in oil and light it on fire. I'm thinking, if you're planning on killing yourself, this is literally the worst way I could think of. And I said, wait here a minute. I went to the office next door where this Kurdish woman worked, and she was like my community liaison, for lack of a better term. She got me up to speed on culture. And her name was Roz. And I said, okay, Roz, I got a girl in my office. We got an arranged marriage, so she's going to go home and kill herself. And without missing a beat, Roz said, yes, she will lay down in the tub, light herself on fire with oil. I'm like, how do you know? She said, that's the only honorable way here out of an arranged marriage. So is the place more or less liberal and more or less decent? Not as much on that day. Now it's a little bit harder to draw conclusions. And then it got weirder still, because I lived in this place for what you'll remember as the Arab Spring. I lived it among Kurds, and it was known by them as the Kurdish Spring. And the Kurdish days of protest began much like they did everywhere else in the Middle East. And all of these people here are on the college campus of the only other college in town. And this is the public school. And public school people, students would go get their education paid for and even get a stipend. So it was radically different from where I was, where there was a tuition that was high and we got the upper class mostly. So everybody met on the campus of Suleimaniye University. They massed, as you can see, and then they started the long walk to the main street in town, which is where all the political parties had their headquarters. And you'll remember that I said our building was tinted green because it was the color of the party that gave us the building. You'll see here next the yellow party, and I never bothered to learn which was which and who is who. I took the approach that I should never talk about interior politics. I was a guest in their country and an ambassador for my own, and I didn't think it was appropriate that I would weigh in. I tried to prevail upon the other professors who were hired there to do the same. So you see on top of that building, there were quite a lot of men. They're all armed with AK-47s, and you can tell that the crowd is somewhat respectful of them, knowing that they've got that kind of firepower up on the top of the roof. But you can see this right now. You can tell that this is a demonstration about to turn into a mob. And with the guys on the roof, that's going to be a little more difficult than they might have imagined. And you can see that guy right there. They're all armed. And here's where it starts to get ugly. They try to kick down a temporary wall. Soon, you'll see them trying to kick down the door to the building. And here's where they exercise most of their anger. Most of the buildings in this area were Soviet-style glass cubes. And you can kind of see that here. And when you have no weapons, but you have a glass cube in front of you and you're upset, they tend to find the rocks rather quickly. And this behavior was let go for a certain amount of time. I think that the people who had the authority to shut this down didn't want to exercise it. Soon they will. And you'll see why they probably didn't have much of a choice. But it gets uglier and uglier and uglier. And that was one of my students. So our students were here doing these things, and you can see the damage that they've done. And now they start kicking on the front gate, and you can probably guess with 100% certainty what's going to happen next. You'll know when you see them all running away. It's a bad camera. There's not much I can do about that. They start by shooting into the air. And that was everybody's notice to remove themselves. And you see them running away. You'll see the news crew right here running out, right? There was a camera and a news crew there on site. It gets worse and worse and worse. I want you to remember this young man, because he was the last one out. He had no idea how to get out from behind that Jersey barrier. And this was the end result. And you knew some people would meet this fate. I knew it from the minute I saw what was happening. So again, what is human flourishing? Because it doesn't seem like he had the chance at that. He couldn't take for granted the same things I could take for granted, and you could too. So let's figure out what human flourishing is, at least to some degree. Here's some evidence. GDP per capita. And you see we're all really poor until right about 1776, when something strange starts to happen in the data. And you might think it's one thing, but it's actually two. And we can look at this, which is roughly the same thing with other countries' timelines on it. US, UK, Japan as emblematic of the first world. All the other first world countries fit into the exact same thing. You can see that they start doing well at roughly the same time the United States does. Ethiopia, China, Brazil, they start at about 1980, 1985, start going up at about that time. So what's going on? What's the story? How can we weave this into a narrative that actually makes sense? And there are two separate things here, both 1776. It was a great year. Declaration of Independence on the one hand, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations on the other. So let's start with Smith. Now, if you've read the Wealth of Nations, this will seem remedial to you. If you haven't read it, this will be a bit of a lifesaver, because you can kind of understand all of Smith if you understand three things. And it's a 2-volume set that is going to take you a long time to read. So I can get you 80% of the way home just with three things. The first is the pursuit of self-interest. You have to be allowed, permitted, to pursue your interest as you understand it. Two, got the division of labor. Simple enough, something we take for granted all the time. Third, free trade. And if you get these three things, Adam Smith says, you will have a functioning economy before long. These are preconditions. And if you meet the preconditions, it'll do you some good. Jefferson, on the other end, doesn't talk about economic things at all. He talks about political and philosophical things. And for him, you only need two things: human equality on the one hand and consent of the governed on the other. You can make the case that he pulls these straight from Locke. I have no problem with that. I don't think it matters. You can point out that Jefferson was a hypocrite and didn't live up to the human equality part, and maybe didn't even live up to the consent part. And I will admit that, yes, that is correct. He did not. Doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that his words are any less true. It means he didn't live up to them. So this yields what I call the math of political economy. pursuit of self-interest, division of labor, free trade, human equality, and consent. Add them all together, and miracles happen. Anywhere you look, with those 5 things firmly entrenched, miracles will happen. And how can we look at this? Well, I can show you some data from our World in Data. It's a great source. Roughly beginning around the time of 1776. You'll see this first one is 1820. I have others that start at 1800, but we're generally speaking in the right ballpark. And, you know, this here, and this is a UN measurement, world population living in extreme poverty went from roughly 95% in 1820 to less than 10% in 2015. That's nothing short of miraculous. Now, you can make an argument, and I often do, that the United Nations doesn't do a particularly good job defining poverty. I think this is people who live on $2 a day or less considered poor. Nonetheless, the trend is clear and it's overwhelming. It doesn't have to be about money either. So from 1800 to 2014, you can see that from almost 90% illiterate, we get to less than 20%. Again, a miraculous kind of move. This one I think is more important, child mortality. And you see that all of a sudden children start living past year 5. They get to be 6 and on and on. And that's a colossal thing. Imagine if you knew with relative certainty that 40% of your children weren't going to make it, how you would have to live. And it's kind of astonishing. Life expectancy around the world, 1770 to 2012, they all at about 1860, the first world is in at about 35 years. The third world, much less, 29 down to 26 for Africa. And what happens? They all start going in this direction. Why? Better diets, better medicines, on and on. The list is endless. Less violence. I know we all think it's more violent now than it's ever been. That's just not true. And you see, the only one that took a downtick here was Africa. Oh, Africa always lags behind. And there was this downtick, and that's fully explainable by when the AIDS virus got to Africa. They did not know how to contain it. So it went down for a bit, the life expectancy, and then right back up again. All right, so third time, what is human flourishing? I'm going to want to get us back to Aristotle. Remember, happiness, he said, is a result of these things. And as I look at the list, I don't know that anything's missing. So here's the kicker. You can achieve happiness in a functional human environment, ours. Can you achieve it where I lived in Iraq? I don't think so. Man is a social animal, he says, which means happiness is going to require others. And some of us, every one of us, likely, I don't want to speak for everyone here, somebody might have been born very far away, are born with every advantage, and we can afford to delay gratification. We can build a foundation for our lives and say, I'm going to do this, so 10 years from now, I can be happy, wealthy, whatever. He never got to say that. He never even got to think it. So what is human flourishing? It's a lot of things, but it's a lot of things that we already had. The problem is just to take advantage of them at this point without losing sight that other people in the world don't have the opportunities we do. And we'd all be a lot happier if they did. And on that somewhat upbeat note at the end, I'll take any questions. I can't see them. I've seen that some were coming, but I can't see them. So do this. Can you read? Can somebody read them to me? If there's anything, just I can't find them. It's going to take me longer to find them.
It doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat. We have someone commenting on the burning, where the only honorable way to get out of an arranged marriage was the burning. Do you have any more information on that you could give?
I do, not on the burning part. Well, I can on the burning part. So keep in mind, I'm living in a city, and the city I was in was roughly the same size as Syracuse, New York, right? We're about 500,000 people in the city proper, and then about 1 million people in the general vicinity. And I went back to Ross after the girl left. Oh, I should tell you, I said, well, here's something you probably haven't considered, but if it were me, I would run. And this was the only time I ever gave somebody life advice when I was there. This was the only time I didn't feel like an ambassador, but I felt more like a person that had to help another person. And she looked at me, and it was clear by the look on her face that she had never even thought of it. It wasn't a consideration. And she said, where would I go? And I said, well, I would get to the Turkish border however I could get there. I would walk over the border. Then I would go to Istanbul. And from there, I would fly to someplace in Eastern or Western Europe. I wouldn't care which, would never tell anybody where I was or why I came. And her head cocked a little bit. And she got up and left. Now, there were about 12 of these immolation suicides in the bathtub with the oil every year. So 12 of 1 million. Right? You're not looking at a lot of people. You're looking at a non-inconsequential number of people.
I'm so sorry, James. We're just out of time.
Okay.
Is there a place we can go to hear more about your story or anything
Sure.
like?
Absolutely. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter at James R. Harrigan. You can email me anytime you like, jrharrigan@gmail.com. And you can find me and my partner, Anthony Davies, on the Words and Numbers podcast, which is the screen that's up. It's been very weird talking to you and not seeing you, but I'm glad that we got to meet, at least in this strange way, and hope we can all meet in person sometime down the road.
Thank you so much, James.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.